Welcome to the Futurist Society Podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Futurist Society, where we are broadcasting from the present and talking about the future. Today, we have Aubrey De Grey, who is a pioneer and leader in the longevity space. Aubrey, the man, the myth, the legend, has had a very illustrious career. He's no stranger to conflict, to scandal, to all sorts of highs and lows, but work that he's doing is really amazing. We're going to be getting into it. So Aubrey, tell us a little bit about where you are right now with longevity, and I really want to talk about this conference that you're having in August. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you're most excited about?
Well, I guess I'm really excited about the acceleration that has happened over the past few years in the pace of the longevity movement in the laboratory and also in the wider world in terms of the changes that are coming along in, the regulatory environment, the general taking seriously the idea that aging is a medical problem that we are within striking distance of really solving. And for myself, I've as you said, I've been around for a little while. I'm proud to have been able to contribute a certain amount to the progress that's being made, and lead an organization, a nonprofit that is focused on doing especially the things that other people are not doing, typically because these things are not aligned with the incentive structure of other groups, perhaps. So we are funded entirely by philanthropy, and that means that we don't have to worry about things like patenting things or publication priority and such like. So we can talk about experiments that we're doing while they are in progress, which is something I certainly like to do. And we do really ambitious, audacious work. Currently, and we'll talk about this, of course, our flagship project is a huge lifespan experiment in mice, looking at combining a bunch of regenerative treatments. So yeah, that's me. That's what I do.
Yeah, I honestly think that right now there's a lot of excitement around the longevity space because people finally are accepting of it. And, I think that there's, over the course of the past few decades that you've been talking about this, I'm sure you probably have seen a lot of people saying a lot of negative things about this. Number one, I think that, probably 20, 30 years ago, people didn't really think that it would work. And now we're proving that this is something that actually has potential benefit, that actually is like real and something that is technologically capable for us as a species. But I feel like even now, I get a lot of people just saying, like, I would never want to live to 100 years. I'm just like what? Why? I don't understand it. What are the things that you say to those people? Like, I feel like it just makes so much sense to me to live for a long time. But for a lot of people, it's like a really scary thing. What do you say to those people?
Well, yeah, I mean, people have different ways of saying that they don't want this. A huge part of the way that I go about addressing that concern is to emphasize that this is not about longevity. I don't work on longevity. I work on health. Same as you do. You're a surgeon, you're an MD, I'm a PhD, but we both work on health. That's all. And this longevity business, that's a side effect of health because people die from being sick by and large. And of course, today in the modern world, and even in the developing world now, the number one cause of being sick is having been born a long time ago. So, that's really all it's about. So you never see people saying, "Oh, I'm terribly scared of not getting Alzheimer's disease. I'm terribly scared of, not getting cancer or atherosclerosis or whatever." But they do seem to be scared of the consequence of not getting any of the things that go wrong with people late in life, namely that you will wake up tomorrow and carry on waking up tomorrow as long as for a lot of tomorrows. And of course, the only reason people are really feeling that way is, number one, they kind of have they have things they don't like about their lives, and they kind of don't want to think about that going on a long time. But that doesn't make them actually suicidal. It doesn't make them shoot themselves. And in those rare occasions when someone does feel they want to not live very much longer, even though they are healthy, both physically and mentally, we try to change their minds, and we feel fairly good that we're fairly good at changing people's minds about that. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of learned helplessness, if you like, but it's also a way of, putting all of this out of one's mind, because people have had to live with the inevitability of aging since the beginning of civilization, since they figured out that aging happens at all. And it's only been very recently that we've got enough knowledge to have been able to formulate a pretty clear plan for how to bring aging under comprehensive medical control. Until that plan was in place, there was no way to put any kind of even probabilistic time frame on how long it would take before we can actually succeed in this venture. And as such, it was kind of rational. It kind of made sense to rationalize aging out of one's mind, however irrational the rationalizations were, right? But now it doesn't make sense at all. Now that's a huge part of the problem. It's just it's a very entrenched, ingrained habit that humanity has.
Yeah, I feel like when I talk to people who are very intelligent people that are afraid of this, they're worried about being 100 years old and having the health of a 100-year-old person. And, that's why I think that in the longevity movement, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this idea of lifespan and health span, right? And so you want to be as healthy as you can be in old age as well. And that's one of the things that I like about your philosophy, which is not the extension of life, but just reversing the effects of aging. Where are we at with that from a scientific perspective? Like, what are some different targets that you have in your research that you're looking at that we could talk about?
Well, yeah, before I answer that question directly, let me say a little more about, the kind of what you said in the preamble to the question. Because you're absolutely right that people do constantly insist, I don't want to, live a long time in a poor state of health, which, of course, completely misses the point that I made a moment ago about lifespan being a side effect of health span. Now, I mean, the thing is, it's not as if it isn't completely obvious that lifespan, that you're not going to live a long time unless you're healthy, that being sick is risky. That's completely obvious. Furthermore, not only I, but also many of my colleagues have been saying it, on stage and on camera for like 20 years. It's not as if people haven't been exposed to this fact. And yet they succeed in somehow putting it out of their mind. It's as if they want to believe that aging is a blessing in disguise and that, death is a good thing because you're going to get sick. It's just complete nonsense. So anyway, coming back to the question, yes, I mean, the I guess the single biggest contribution that I've made scientifically over these years has been 20 odd years ago when I realized that it's actually going to be easier to reverse aging than to slow it down.
Right.
And reversing aging meaning repairing the self-inflicted damage, the damage that accumulates in the body as a consequence of our normal metabolism throughout life, and that eventually becomes abundant enough to be pathogenic.
Mm-hmm.
That damage is... we understand in pretty good detail what that damage is at the molecular and cellular level, what the actual differences in molecular and cellular structure and composition are between, let's say, a 20-year-old and a 50-year-old. And absolutely, the other huge advantage, not only that it's technically easier to repair that damage rather than to slow down the rate at which the body creates it. Not only that, of course, it means that these therapies are going to be very applicable to people who are already in middle age or older. Whereas if you're only slowing down the creation of subsequent damage, then, people are not going to get biologically younger again.
So I really like everything that you just said. But one of the things that I did want to talk about is just like the science behind the reversal. I'm familiar with these Yamanaka factors, which is things that they apply to cells to reverse age them on the cellular level. You can take like a skin cell and make it into a stem cell, right? Is that the target that a lot of this technology, like what is the science behind all this stuff? How are we doing this?
Yeah. So let me go back to let me go to that question vaguely chronologically. So when I first began to think about the idea of addressing aging with damage repair rather than slowing down the creation of damage, of course, the only way that I could decide whether that was a sensible idea was to crystallize it into, what is the damage and how can we go about repairing it. Now, of course, the body is an insanely complicated machine, and lo and behold, it does damage to itself in a lot of different ways. So the first thing I did was I thought, well, okay, let me think about all the types of damage, molecular and cellular damage that I know about, and let me classify them into categories and see how many categories we get. And the number of categories ended up being pretty manageable. I ended up with 7. Now, what's the purpose of this classification? The basic purpose is to describe a corresponding list of damage repair modalities, of how you would actually do the damage repair. And the idea was that you'd have a kind of, within each category, there might be a lot of examples. The same generic approach to repairing those examples would be applicable across the entire category. However, between categories, you still need different intervention, right? Parenthetically, let me just say, this was a big paradigm shift for the field 20-odd years ago, and it took me maybe 10 years to really get the field to understand what I was saying and to acknowledge that and to appreciate that it was a good, productive, promising way to think about the issue. Now that's very much mainstream, and over the past 10 years, there have been a number of papers that have come out from other groups that are very credentialed mainstream people, essentially saying the same thing as I had said back in the year 2000, 2002. But one thing that I don't really think that most people have really got the message on is the need to have this correspondence between the category and the damage repair approach. And kind of not emphasized enough. I think that's a point if you don't say that. So let me come back to these categories. So one of the categories in my original formulation was cell loss. So that just means cells dying and not being naturally replaced by the division of other cells. And mostly that comes down to stem cell loss, because cells can be replaced, obviously, by the division and differentiation of stem cells. In some cases, it's important for the individual cells to be long-lived. So in the brain, for example, neurons, the brain works because neurons are individually long-lived, and there's very little neuronal replacement. Similarly, in the heart, you've got, cardiomyocytes just kind of do their thing. But by and large, stem cells are quite important to replenish things. And of course, in some tissues like the blood, you've got stem cells dividing regularly, pretty infrequently, because then there's a lot of amplification of cells that goes on during the differentiation process, but still, regularly. And then in other tissues, you've got stem cells that basically just hang out and don't do anything to speak of unless there is some kind of injury, some kind of stress that happens that causes them to need to divide. Nevertheless, the idea of using stem cell therapies to replace cells that are not being replaced automatically seems like a good idea. The most conspicuous example that I like to use is Parkinson's disease, where you've got one particular type of neuron in a particular part of the brain, it's a very small place, the substantia nigra, where the rate of death of those neurons is very much faster than it is in the rest of the brain, simply because dopaminergic neurons do a lot. They work hard and they die a lot. Stem cell therapy for Parkinson's disease was actually explored in the clinic 30-odd years ago in Sweden. There was a clinical trial. There were a couple more in the US. And it works occasionally. Mm-hmm. The occasional part is quite important. Basically, the reason why it only worked occasionally was because we didn't have any idea how to manipulate stem cells in the lab back then. And so these patients were given stem cells isolated from broadly the right part of the brain of aborted fetuses. And, of course, it was very hit and miss. But occasionally when these patients got the right stem cells, their response was unbelievably strong. They basically had no Parkinsonian symptoms for more than a decade, despite being completely taken off L-DOPA and so on. It was extraordinary. However, because it was impossible to know whether you had the right kind of stem cell, essentially this whole approach was abandoned. Well, until now. Now we have, of course, the ability to create stem cells of pretty much any type we like, using iPS technology, for example. And we can now, therefore, do a much more rationally designed clinical trial, and that is indeed happening. There's a trial going on already in Japan. There's a couple more starting up in the US. People are very optimistic about this approach. So why do I mention all this in response to what you said about the Yamanaka factors? Well, it's basically because in the past decade, there has been a lot of progress in using the Yamanaka factors in vivo. You achieve with that, in principle, you might be able to achieve, is to increase the number of stem cells of a particular sort or of many different sorts simultaneously in the body without injecting stem cells, but rather by taking cells that had become a little, had kind of, they're kind of stem cells, but they've kind of lost some of their stemness through, whatever, and to now restore that stemness. And this was first tried in a kind of just a proof of concept experiment by a great friend of mine named Manuel Serrano. He didn't actually try to do it in a therapeutically relevant way. He just made some mice and made them constitutively overexpress the Yamanaka factors. And he said, well, okay, just wanted to know whether it would work, whether this would cause dedifferentiation to occur in vivo in mice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He knew that if it worked, then the mice would be very unhappy because they would get these things called teratomas, these particular types of cancer that you get when they don't know what to do. And that's exactly what happened. Teratomas all over the mice. So that was great. But then Manuel was doing other things. He had other interests, so he didn't pursue this any further. Instead, the person who really ran with this and did the natural next step was another Spaniard named Carlos Belmonte at the Salk Institute in San Diego. He did exactly the same experiment, except that he made his genetic construct for the Yamanaka factors inducible, drug-inducible, which means that he was able to turn the Yamanaka factors on and off and to explore, various different frequencies of the turning on and off. He was able to hit on a frequency, I think it was something like 2 days a week, to express these things that cause, clear benefits arising from improved regenerative capacity without causing teratomas.
Yeah.
Exactly what you want. And lo and behold, this has become the most fashionable thing in the whole biology of aging. There's huge amounts of money come into it. Jeff Bezos created a company called Altos Labs, which has got $3 billion.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's a company called New Limit created by the founder of Coinbase, who's also put in like 9 digits. There's another company called Retro, which is one of its major areas. That's been funded by Sam Altman, again, to the tune of 9 digits. Mm-hmm. So we're talking, proper money that's going into this area.
I mean, I would pay for it. I think everybody, those naysayers, I
do want to manage expectations a bit here because there is a very clear potential issue with this. And this is an issue which always arises when one is manipulating regenerative potential, which is we might end up increasing the risk of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, and I'm here talking about normal cancers, not teratomas, right?
Right.
The risk here is that in cell culture, okay, you can do a whole bunch of stuff, but when you do something in vivo,
mm-hmm.
Being done indiscriminately to all cells,
mm-hmm.
then you've got the problem that you and I are full of cells that have already accumulated most of the mutations necessary to be a cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Only, most of them, but that still means that if you like the network of machinery that stops them from dividing inappropriately is more fragile than it is in a healthy cell that hasn't got the mutation.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing with the Yamanaka factors is you're smacking the regulatory machinery with a sledgehammer, and if that regulatory machinery is already somewhat more fragile than normal, then occasionally you may end up turning the cell into a proper cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that you can't ask this question in mice because they just don't live long enough. Mice die of cancer a lot. You probably know that. But the cancers they die of are ones that emerge, that started out really early in the life of the mouse, because that's the only way they can grow far enough to kill the mouse in a normal lifetime. If you're taking mice that are already in middle age and you're making cells cancerous, those cells are not going to kill the mouse. You're not going to find out because they haven't got time. They're going to be killed by other things first. And so, I believe that this is a big question. And that's why I'm still very interested in the possibility that there might be other ways to do partial reprogramming, to do in vivo dedifferentiation that do not involve the Yamanaka factors. Instead, that involve gentler factors that can potentially make cells more regenerative, but not so regenerative as to be pluripotent. There's a very important transition that happens during early development called the embryonic fetal transition, maybe week 8, something like that in humans, that kind of time. And this is a time when tissues switch from having a regenerative response to injury into having a fibrotic response, a scarring response. This transition, if you can make cells not do that, then you've got a hugely improved regenerative capacity. And indeed, I more or less do this. Salamanders known to have this enormous regenerative capacity, right? They basically stay in the embryonic state. They don't go through this transition. So that's a transition that some of my colleagues in a company named Agex have been looking at, and I definitely feel that needs to be explored more. I should emphasize I have no financial interest there. I just think it's very exciting technology and it's being scandalously neglected.
Well, I think the excitement is something that is felt even from someone who's not involved with it. Like, just to give you an idea, I live in Cambridge, just a stone's throw from MIT. And there was recently a conference here, and that gentleman you spoke about, Carlos, was there. And there was literally so many people there that the fire department had to be called in. They had to kick people out. So like the excitement, I think, is now emanating outwards such that everybody's interested in this stuff. I mean, me, like I'm just tangentially interested in futurism and stuff like that. But the real thing that I get excited about is longevity. And the fact of the matter is that it just seems so not only like a moonshot, but also so reachable, right? Like, I feel like we're making progress. People are talking about it. Really respected people are talking about it. How is it for you in that space, experiencing all this excitement? Like, what are you most excited about when it comes to like the different things that are happening?
Well, you've really put your finger on it. The thing I'm most excited about is the excitement, the increasing excitement in the wider world. I'm just a scientist. I'm doing my best to come up with the best ideas and to take this science forward and to oversee, great teams of people who are doing this. But, what really matters is to see, is to have large numbers of people doing this, not just because science needs diversity of ideas, but also because it's not just the development of these therapies, it's their dissemination. We need policymakers, decision makers, opinion formers around the world to be taking this as seriously as it merits, as it deserves, and to ease people out of the irrational rationalizations that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think that, those irrational rationalizations are definitely out there. Like, I was talking with another professor at Tufts University where I teach, and I was telling her, I'm going to be speaking with Aubrey De Grey. I'm really excited about this whole idea of lifespan. I mean, like, don't you want to live to be 100? And she literally said, no, I don't want to be that. And she's like going down the list of all like these issues. But I want you to tell me, as somebody that's in this space, what are the downstream benefits for humanity? Obviously, selfishly, I want to live to be 100. But there's so many benefits that I think that are out there. People look at overpopulation and, they're worried about the resources, but you being in this space, you must see some of the positive responses to these negative comments.
Right. Well, I mean, there's the positive consequence of not getting sick. Sickness is miserable. People suffer. In fact, it's very clear, it's unequivocal that aging is the major source of suffering in the world today by a huge distance. The death part, just the suffering that happens first. So, solving that, if you want to try and say that would be a bad idea, then you've got to try and say that the problems that would be created as a consequence of solving the problem we have today would be even worse than the problem we have today. And that's a high bar.
Right.
Yeah. But coming to what you were asking, there would be this or that problem created as a consequence of solving the problem we have today. Complete nonsense. I mean, they're transparent nonsense. It's trivial to explain why they are nonsense. And so, again, it's a case of just like wanting not to hear the answer.
Specifically, what about overpopulation? Overpopulation is like, I feel like that's like the number one response. Because I talk about this at like dinner parties and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh my God, aren't you so excited about it? And that's like the number one response that I get is the people are worried about overpopulation.
It is the single most common one. So let's look at it. So first of all, we have to ask, what would be the demographic consequence of eliminating aging, right? It certainly would mean people living longer, in other words, fewer people dying in any given calendar year. But we've got to look at a couple of things here. First of all, look at what's happening in the population today. We see about 150,000 people dying every day. There's about 350,000 people being born every day. So even if we just halved the birth rate, we would already have a declining population. People would say, well, I want to have kids. Well, do you? First of all, let's look at that. In every society that has gone through what's often called the demographic transition, where women get to the point of having enough, education and emancipation and prosperity, the birth rate plummets. The average number of kids that that a woman has in their life plummets. And also, they have those kids later, which means that if we didn't have aging anymore, one of the things we wouldn't have would be menopause. I mean, you'd be able to turn it on and off, right? So women could have kids safely at whatever age. The immediate reaction is, oh dear, that means the overpopulation is going to be terribly bad. But the thing is, if you can have your kids later, then maybe you're going to choose to have your kids later. And that's, of course, what we already see, that when any society goes through that demographic transition to having fewer kids, they also have the kids later. As of today, only a little bit later because of menopause, but the same logic is going to apply. But on top of all of that, and perhaps the most fundamental reason why this overpopulation thing is a complete red herring, is that the overpopulation we have today is a big problem, but it's not a problem of having enough space. If you do the numbers, you'll easily see that, as of today, with 8 billion people on the planet, every single person could have their own acre. Without even, going into anywhere that's not much fun to live. We've got like the amount of land that exists in the world overall is like something like 60 billion acres, right? So, 40 billion acres, which means like everyone could have 5 acres. Or if you use the most agreeable 20% of the land mass of the world, then you've still got an acre each. Yeah, that's not. So what's the real problem is pollution. The fact that we're pumping out a whole bunch of greenhouse gas and, doing things that can't be recycled and so on. But that's all being fixed as well. With how to do carbon capture and desalination and all of these things. And these technologies are coming sooner than anything that I'm working on. So the so-called overpopulation problem is going to get less bad whether or not the population increases a little bit faster than it otherwise would.
Yeah, I think that when I hear those kind of negative responses, I think it's a matter of perspective, right? I think that it's people that are only looking through their lens of like what exists right now. And they're not taking into account all of these other breakthroughs that are happening in all these other fields. Like we are on an exponential growth rate and change rate as a species, unlike anything that we've ever seen before. I mean, things like AI and, electric cars and all of this other stuff that we looked at as science fiction are now science fact, right? And so who knows what we'll be capable of in the future? And I think that that's a personal opinion. Like either you look at that open-ended possibility and you look at that with excitement, or you look at that with like a negative sentiment. And that's something that I hope that people start to change their idea of what's capable in the future.
Right. So it's important to say that sort of thing a little bit carefully, because it's easy to say it in a way that that opens oneself to the accusation of being a dreamer, just like saying, oh, it'll be all right on the night.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very, very important not to do that, not to say, well, you don't know, who knows what technology is going to come along to make everything fine. Rather to look at specific technologies and say, based on what we already have today, what we already know, what is the probability that these technologies will come along in such and such a time frame?
Yeah.
So I do that, of course, in relation to anti-aging technology in the first place, but I also think we need to do it in relation to all these other technologies. Because quite a lot of the answers to these concerns that people bring up, the other concerns that people bring up, are just like the overpopulation one in that sense, in the sense that there are other technologies which will, with very high probability, ensure that the problem doesn't arise. Another one that often comes up is, oh dear, how will we pay all the pension?
Yeah.
And of course, you just mentioned AI, which I think the area I used to work in before I became a biologist.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that on another podcast.
Yeah. So, of course, the whole purpose of AI, the humanitarian purpose, is automation. It's to solve the problem of work, the problem that people have to spend so much of their time doing stuff that they would not do unless they were being paid for it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's coming, right? Hello, it's coming. It's coming a lot faster than this aging stuff, anti-aging stuff. So that means that we will not have an economy that is based on the concept of full employment. We just won't.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I really do, and I think that those societal changes.
Yeah, and it is really important to get across because the if one thinks in terms of the short-sighted thing about pensions, and one thinks, well, the economic consequences of defeating aging will be negative. When in fact, the exact opposite is true. The economic impact of defeating aging will be astoundingly large.
I agree.
Positive, because being sick is really expensive. The majority of the medical budget of the Western world goes on the healthcare of the elderly. Therefore, these things will pay for themselves unbelievably fast, unbelievably many times over. And then it's important to get across for another reason that comes up. People will say, oh, it's only going to be for the rich. They'll say, okay, these things are going to be expensive, these therapies, therefore only the rich are going to get them. And of course, it's easy to come to that conclusion by extrapolation from today's medical care, where, there are certainly expensive things that are only available, to those who can afford them. But the point is, the only reason society is okay with that is because these therapies do not pay for themselves, largely because they don't really work, especially when we're talking about therapies for the elderly. They just extend the sick span rather than the health span, but a little bit. And of course, companies make money out of it. But as I said, the only reason society puts up with that is because there's no alternative. Whereas therapies that do actually work will pay for themselves and will be demanded by society.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that the way that I look at economies in general is that you're trying to maximize human productivity. And if you extend people's health span, you're going to have people that are more willing and able to do amazing things. And I think that this idea of pensions, it's just it's 20th century thinking. We're gonna figure it out if we have this new demographic shift. I look at it in that, man, it's going to be great that these older people can care for themselves, right? Because that's what we want, right? We want to be able to I don't want to be 90 and having my daughter having to take care of me. I want her to live her own life. I want to live my own life at 90. I want to be traveling the world and seeing all these amazing things. But for the most part, I think that it's just again a matter of perspective. I agree with you that it might sound dreamy, it might sound hopefully optimistic, but that's just who I am. I think in baseline, I do a lot of things that are very realistic on a daily basis, and it's nice to think about the future in these dreamy terms. What are you doing with your conference? I want to talk specifically about that because honestly, when in the medical profession, that's where really a lot of thought happens. That's where, when surgeons get together in a room, we talk about what the best technology is, what everything is going. What is going on at your conference? What are the things that you hope that get kind of ironed out and talked about over there?
Right. Well, actually, let me talk about conferences in general a little bit first, because I agree with you very much. And in fact, I will go further. when I started out, my interest was in coming up with the best plan to bring aging under medical control. So my community was researchers. But I spent a lot of time at conferences, paying my way to conferences before I became prominent. And, it made all the difference. I went to a very diverse range of conferences, and that was enormously instrumental in allowing me to come up with the ideas that I did. But I became aware very quickly that we needed to get the word out and educate people a lot, and to build a community. To bring people in who, did not feel that this was really their thing. And so I started running my own conferences 20 years ago, and I started out doing it in Cambridge. Actually, that's the real Cambridge, not the upstate Cambridge.
The imposter where I live, right?
So I ran 6 of those every alternate year between 2003 and 2013. And they were the absolute epicenter of my ability to build a community. I mean, I was already, certainly towards the end of that period, I was doing a lot of media, I was obviously, doing a lot of public speaking. But the conferences, extraordinarily successful. There's, probably half of the prominent people in this field right now who are under the age of 50 are people who were introduced to the community at one or other of my conferences. That much.
Yeah.
And so I have very much carried on doing that. We ran a couple of conferences in California. We ran a couple of conferences in Berlin. Then there was, of course, the lockdown, which put an end to that for a couple of years. But starting last September, I rebooted my conference series, and in this case, it is in Dublin. And it was a really great reboot last time. It coincided with the launch of my newest foundation, the LEV Foundation. And so, it was a real celebration. This year, the speaking roster is even better. Honestly, it's like probably the single most illustrious speaking roster I've ever put together. Got absolutely everybody in the field. But of course, the really important thing about conferences, as you said, is the unexpected stuff. So I've always placed a great emphasis on the recreational component, on giving a lot of free time, making sure that the bar is free every night, things like that. And that's really the magic that happens. So
yeah,
and Dublin is a great place to have a like that.
That's what they say that really pushed a lot of these companies like IBM and Bell Labs forward in their technological progress, is when they had a campus and then, a place where people could socialize with each other. And I've seen it firsthand in like my own field, right? Like you get a bunch of people together that are interested in the same thing. They're talking about this stuff, and then new ideas spring from that very easily. Listen, I would love to talk to you for a long time, but I do know that we're getting to the end of our time together. So I wanted to do what I do with every guest, which is end the talk with 3 questions. I know that this is something that you've been passionate about for a long time. The first question that I have for you is, like, for me, what I've gotten a lot of inspiration from is science fiction. And when I think about the future, I think about all the different science fiction scenarios that happen, from Isaac Asimov with robots to Star Trek and this Utopia to all sorts of different things. But is there anything that you draw inspiration from that really fuels that passion that you have behind this field?
To be honest, what fuels the passion I have is the people around me, my team, my community. I get such inspiration and such pride from the fact that there are so many people around who I really look up to, because they're just as passionate as me, and they work just as hard, and they don't get people coming up to them in the street and asking for their autograph, right? But they're driven anyway, and so I really admire my people. The science fiction aspect, well, actually, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with science fiction, because by and large, the portrayals of a post-aging world in science fiction, especially in movies these days, are extraordinarily distorted and indeed dystopic. There's pander to the irrationality I was talking about earlier, and try to, make a scenario that lets the audience, walk out of the movie theater with their pro-aging irrationality, entrenched and enhanced.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't think much of that. There's one movie I'd like to point out, though, a movie called The Man from Earth. It's a fantastic movie. Hardly anyone knows it, and it actually portrays the lack of aging in a very positive way.
That's awesome.
But I think we need much more of this. I think, I've been trying. I have a script idea that I occasionally share with directors and so on. And I'm hoping one day somebody will actually run with it. The idea, basically, you have a post-aging world that's, the movie starts out with a post-aging world that's working completely fine and there's nothing wrong at all. And of course, you can't do a movie based on that because, there's no dramatic element, except that the dramatic element comes from the plot that what happens at the beginning of the movie, which is that aging comes back. There's some infection that comes along or whatever, and suddenly everyone's aging again the way they used to in the 20th century. And then there's a huge, civilization comes together in the way that it would if it wanted to, avoid the Earth being hit by an asteroid or whatever. And so one could totally make a movie out of that.
Yeah, I like that aspect of making a clarification between dystopian and utopian. I think that there is not enough. There's not enough scientists that are interested in the longevity community to make a good utopian view of it, and that's why it's nice to hear like your idea. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of dystopian and nihilistic views of the future from science fiction, but I really think that a lot of the positive aspects overweigh the negative aspects to that specifically. But the second question I wanted to ask is, talking about the future, I always think about the younger generation, right? Like when I'm teaching the students that I teach and everything like that, if somebody wants to get involved with longevity, if you had like a young 18-year-old kid, they're going to college for the first time and they look at Aubrey De Grey and they're like, man, I really want to help him, cure aging. What would you say to that kid?
Well, okay. First thing is, I'm very much a man of the people kind of guy. So, I have one email address, and it's public, aubrey@levf.org. So anybody, however, whether they're 18 or anything else, can perfectly well write to me. Indeed, people of that age come to my conferences because, that's where you meet people and you find out which lab you might want to go into or what you might want to study and so on. There are also other opportunities. So, I've spearheaded and kickstarted a number of educational initiatives where, for example, undergrads will come for a few months in the summer and learn about longevity and learn lab techniques and so on. There's a new organization called Less Death, which I kickstarted last year, and which is actually bringing in not so much focusing on youngsters there, but focusing on people that have credentials and a track record already in some other area, like they're entrepreneurs, for example, and they want to get involved in the field, but they don't really know how. This is a way of getting, they run retreats where you get to meet people, you get to learn stuff, you get to, form collaboration. So yeah, this is absolutely essential. This is very much, a very big part of the community building thing. The youngsters, absolutely.
Yeah, but basic sciences that they could go into. Would you say like biochemistry, microbiology? Like, what are some of the career tracks that are open to people that are interested in this kind of thing?
So when people are in high school and they ask me, what kind of undergrad degree should I do, I always say don't specialize too much. Do a general biology degree. The reason for that is really that aging affects the organism at every level of organization. So in order to think properly about aging, you've really got to have a pretty good grounding in everything, genetics, biochemistry, cell biology, molecular biology, physiology, anatomy, there's a lot. And so don't generalize too soon. When people want to know, for example, they decided they want to do a PhD, then I always say, think of something that you're really passionate about, because research is extraordinarily frustrating and you're going to have to keep your spirits up. But also ideally work in a relatively small lab so that you won't be just a small cog in some machine. Those are the kinds of things I say. But again, also don't just work in things that call themselves the biology of aging, because regenerative medicine and damage repair involves a lot of different technologies that are predominantly developed by people for other reasons. And you should be creative and think about what kind of thing you want to do and then look at where you want to do it without going the other way around.
Nice.
What I say.
Yeah, that's cool. So last question. So I didn't get an opportunity to ask you about this in our talk, but I actually had written it down. The previous person that I had a conversation with was a futurist, and I was like, I'm talking to Aubrey De Grey. He's like, oh, you really need to ask him about epigenetics. He said that epigenetics are where he thinks that the real, golden chalices. And I know tangentially what he means. Like the epigenetics is the ability to turn on and off genes. Things like smoking, can cause epigenetic changes that can be inherited. And that's an acquired change to your physiology. What does he mean by that? And what are you seeing in regards to the technology that's exploiting that?
So what he means by it is essentially something we've already touched on today, namely partial reprogramming. Mm-hmm. So that means, making a cell more stem-like, turning back its differentiation clock, so to speak. That is an epigenetic change. Mm-hmm. It's turning different genes on and off than what were on and off before. And it's the same as what happens in the fertilized egg. These factors were discovered because of their role in early embryogenesis. They essentially wipe the epigenetic slate clean and start it from from the ultimate totipotent or pluripotent state. And so it's become exciting now, not just because of the progress that's been made in partial reprogramming, but also because of the progress that's been made in developing these things called epigenetic clocks, which ways to estimate one's biological age from the state of one's epigenome. Mm-hmm. So, it's no surprise that the $3 billion that Jeff Bezos decided to drop on partial reprogramming has been used not only to hire the top people in partial reprogramming, including Belmonte and Serrano and the people we mentioned earlier, but also the top people in epigenetic clocks like Steve Horvath and Morgan Levine. That's what it's all about.
So sorry, I know I said that was going to be the last question, but I just got to get this out there because I remembered again while we were talking. So I've followed you for a while, and historically you've always said that you're not really doing anything in particular to delay aging, that you don't really have a regimen yourself. Has that changed at all? Are you doing anything different? Because that's where a lot of the people that I think that are in the space will say, like, I do A, B, and C, Dr. Attia is talking about exercise being his number one thing. Dr. Sinclair has his own regimen. Anything that you're doing now since the last time I've heard you speak that is different to delay aging at all?
Yeah, no, I don't really do anything. But I don't say that's because it's inappropriate to do things. It's just that it's so different from one person to the next. So the person that I most often get contrasted with in this regard is Ray Kurzweil, who takes, a couple of hundred supplements a day or something like that. But the thing is, he's drawn a bunch of short straws. He's he's got a lot of cardiovascular disease in his family. He came down with type 2 diabetes in his 30s, which, as you know, is not exactly common.
Right.
He's been able to bring these things under control and very strongly normalize his rate of aging. Whereas I'm on the other end of that spectrum. I'm just really lucky. I can eat and drink exactly what I like and nothing really happens. I've never put on weight. I don't have to exercise to speak of. That it's extremely important to regulate one's sleep patterns. And of course, it is absolutely correct that sleep is important. But I sleep like a baby, pretty much, whatever happens. I don't have to do anything in order to have a good, stable sleep pattern.
Nice.
Yeah. So basically, everything that people like Peter Attia and David Sinclair and so on say is perfectly fine. It's just, it's different things for different people. The only general advice that one can give is pay attention to your body. If I had drawn some short straws, I would definitely be doing things that other people are doing. And of course, as time goes on, I've just hit 60. Maybe I will need to do some of these things that I don't need to do right now. The other thing to, of course, bear in mind is that even if you do exactly what's right for you, you're only going to gain a little bit relative to just generically living the way your mother told you to and not getting overweight and not smoking and, having a reasonably varied diet. And therefore, the emphasis absolutely has to be on developing things that don't yet exist that will be able to benefit humanity and postpone the health problems of late life by a far greater amount than we can do today by anything.
That's a really good thing to talk about, is that everybody is different. And, I think the starting point for everyone should be go see your physician, get the tests that you need to make sure that you're avoiding some of these short straws that you're talking about. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. For our listeners, it's been really nice having you. I look forward to seeing you guys again in the future. Thanks again, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.